Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Welcome to the first public lecture organized by the new Initiative on Environmental Justice and the Common Good here at Santa Clara. If you haven't checked your phone, please check it. Make sure it's off right now. My name is Chad Raphael. I'm a member of the Initiative's Faculty Collaborative, which also includes Chris Bacon and Iris Stewart-Fry from Environmental Studies and Sciences, Ed Maurer from Engineering, and Siming Yang from the Law School. Our staff members include Maria Eugenia Flores Gomez, Daniel Mendoza, and Zaya Bomani. The initiative provides training, resources, and networking to foster community-driven research for social and environmental justice here at Santa Clara, in Northern California, and across Jesuit education. Our speaker is in a very unique and important position to teach us about how and how not to do that. Kyle Powys-White is the 2020 Faculty Visiting Chair in Philosophy here at Santa Clara. At Michigan State University, his home institution, he is the Timnick Chair in the Humanities, a professor of philosophy and community sustainability, faculty member of the Environmental Philosophy and Ethics Graduate Concentration and the Geocognition Research Lab, and a faculty affiliate of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies and Environmental Science and Policy programs. He's Potawatomi and an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. His work focuses on climate and environmental justice and indigenous environmental studies. His research, his teaching, his training, and his activism address moral and political issues concerning climate policy and indigenous peoples and the ethics of cooperative relationships among indigenous peoples and climate science organizations. His work also addresses indigenous food sovereignty and indigenous critiques of concepts of the Anthropocene. Dr. White's work extends beyond the walls of academia as well. He's deeply involved in projects through the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group, the Sustainable Development Institute of the College of Menominee Nation, a tribal climate camp, Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, Humanities for the Environment, and the Consortium for Socially Relevant Philosophy of and in Science and Engineering. Also serves on a lot of boards and steering and advisory committees, including Napeote Maramatanga, New Zealand's Maori Center of Research Excellence, the Center for Indigenous Environmental Health Research, Facilitating Indigenous Research Science and Technology, the Sustainable Michigan Endowed Project, the National Indian Youth Council, the Pesticide Action Network, and the U.S. Federal Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science. I began to read Dr. White's work last summer. I can tell you it's important, it's fascinating, and there's absolutely no substitute for reading it yourselves. So I urge you to read it. As I read it, I was struck by how much we have to learn from him about indigenous experiences, environmental knowledge, and sovereignty, and about filling in the blind spots in our own thinking about justice and environmental justice, and about how to be respectful, constructive, and humble allies and partners of the Ohlone and other indigenous peoples in this area and beyond. As a university, we've begun to take some steps down that long road, led by the Ohlone History Working Group, chaired by Margaret Russell and Rebecca Schaap, some of whose members are here tonight, and the Native American Coalition for Change student group, some of whose members I hope are here tonight as well, and also by members of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone peoples who participate in university events, such as the recent inauguration of President O'Brien. And one of those very small steps down that much, much longer road of reconciliation and decolonization is for us to pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give not uncomplicated thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people of the past and present. Dr. Kyle White.
Bonjour, les bons coming Indigenous, Potawatomi and Lansing, Michigan, Doshbia. It's good to be here in the Ohlone territory, and I was excited to have a chance to spend the quarter at Santa Clara. I've long been a huge admirer of the work of Rosemary Camara, and In fact, for the class I'm teaching on Indigenous environmental justice and sustainability, we started off by reading one of the articles that they were an author on. And I actually think, in honoring the important work that California Native folks and the Ohlone and Wekpe Ohlone have done in this region, that community-based scholarship, tribally based Indigenous scholarship is one of those contributions that I know those of us from other parts of Turtle Island that we really admire. And so it's a privilege to have a chance to teach that work and engage that work in the homeland. I look forward to sharing when I go back to our part of the world, the Anishinaabe world in Michigan, to talk about what I've learned here. So for this presentation, I was hoping to connect with you all on just this question of, as folks working or studying at universities, how can we do a whole lot better in engaging in research and teaching in service? It actually empowers Indigenous people. And the reason why this question is important is that most of us were taught some extremely bad habits about what it means to increase or improve the diversity of Native people on a campus. And in my work, in my career, not just because I'm a Potawatomi person, but just overall as a relative, wanted to really do things that flipped the script that we're often taught in the university, and to not think of it as a matter of Santa Clara University or Michigan State University reaching out to Native folks or trying to include Native folks, but instead thinking about ourselves as individuals who can actually do work that starts with the interests, the aspirations, and goals that Indigenous people, that Native folks have, regardless of whether universities exist at all. And for us to find ways to be part of the stories of tribal people, of Native people, as our communities find innovative ways to respond to some of the most horrendous things that you can imagine. And so for this reason, I wanted to cover in the presentation a number of different examples of projects that I'm part of that really define my work, where I've tried to really create educational and research sovereignty from the standpoint of not only my tribe, but other tribes that I'm connected to through work that I do primarily on climate change and climate justice, but also more broadly on environmental justice. And I've really tried to use my role and position as faculty member at a university to be a resource, to be a tool, to be a capacity that eventually could decenter the privilege that so many of these university campuses have and restore a sense that actually it should be us as Native people that have the central education institutions that are able to generate our own research projects and generate our own teaching. And so that's a little bit of the story that I want to tell here. So to get started with sort of these quick examples, and I think we'll go for a little bit, but I'm hoping for some good time to chat with you all in the Q&A. So I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and one of the things that's greatly influenced me in my work is that we're a people whose homelands is from the Great Lakes region. And so when I got a job at Michigan State, one of the things that I really wanted to do was be part of or connect with projects that were protecting and stewarding and being responsible for the environment of the Great Lakes. And that's really where I got my first sense of what it meant to have collaborations that bridged science and Native peoples. So one of the first projects that I was part of, primarily as somebody that was trying to reconstruct why it was an effective project, was the little river band of Odawa Indians, which is a tribe in Michigan. They traditionally depended on sturgeon for their way of life, and sturgeon was a clan fish for them and extremely important to their culture. But the problem is that in Michigan and other parts of the Great Lakes, the settler population had just done a number on the sturgeon population, whether through dams, logging, or all sorts of other things that they did to the environment, which messed up sturgeon habitat. And the project that I was trying to work with some great folks there, like Marty Holtgren and Jimmy Mitchell, was to actually understand how the tribe had successfully restored the sturgeon population. And the way that they did it was a team of about 30 people in the tribe, tribal members, of all different ages, all different walks of life. They formed a group called the Cultural Context Committee, and that group connected with scientists, both from federal and state agencies, but also from universities, to create a coalitional approach to how to understand sturgeon habitat, the threats to sturgeon habitat, and then how to create a system by which you could begin slowly to reintroduce sturgeon into the river system in the area. And the most interesting part for me about the project is that it wasn't just about the science of restoring sturgeon and protecting sturgeon habitat, but every year they now have a sturgeon ceremony, and that's a picture of it, where people from the community, hundreds of people, go there. They get to learn about sturgeon, both Odawa Indigenous traditions of sturgeon, but also scientific information about sturgeon. And then the ones that are big enough to be released back, each person that attends gets the chance to pick up one of those buckets and personally release the young sturgeon back into the river, where it will then hopefully reintegrate and be part of a restored ecosystem. And so in this way, this was a project that combined all these things. It combined science, it combined Indigenous people's knowledge and traditions, it brought in the community, and it got people from this particular region. People actually didn't get along with each other that well because of the violence of the colonialism that had existed in that region historically. And they got together around something they all could care about, which was a native species. And so the sturgeon ceremony gets a lot of people, and it's something where you really see how collaboration that bridges research organizations and tribes can do amazing work. An area that I've worked in a lot is the conservation of wild rice. And in particular, I've been active in efforts to facilitate and bring together the University of Minnesota and wild rice harvesters who are part of the Chippewa tribe of Minnesota, so Anishinaabe people. And Potawatomi, we're part of the Anishinaabe group, and wild rice is very important to our culture. And so in this work, one of the important facets of it is that oftentimes university scientists were just looking at wild rice as an object to be studied, and missing the idea that actually wild rice for Anishinaabe people is spiritual. It's part of who we are, and people who harvest wild rice believe that that's their responsibility to protect the habitats of wild rice. That's part of their family life, their cultural life. And so a huge part of being a mediator in this context is to begin to find ways for academic researchers and researchers coming from tribes, from indigenous people, to find common purpose in how they engage in wild rice habitat. And so a lot of native people, they were worried that non-native scientists were just doing any type of research to try to understand how wild rice could be commercially produced. And one of the key outcomes of some of this facilitation was for researchers to realize that it was important that their goals as research weren't just defined by things that they were curious from or curious about in the absence of any other values, but rather that they were doing research that supported the goals that tribes had to protect wild rice habitat and to make sure that future generations would be able to enjoy and have a connection, relationship to the plant. And I branched out from this work to actually be part of the organization of community events that were also about bringing in people from the university that had never worked with Indigenous people before. So I don't know how many or how much you all know about wild rice, but one of the key events around the wild rice harvesting season, which is in the fall, is what's called a wild rice camp. That's when lots of people get together, they harvest, they process the rice, they hang out, they talk, ceremony. It's a wonderful time of year, and oftentimes can take a number of days depending on what camp that you go to. And so I've organized a number of different wild rice camps where university scientists that work on climate change actually come to the camp and actually participate. And we're working with elders and with younger folks in the camp experience to help teach people what threats climate change was posing to wild rice. And the important part about this is that, like, for example, this rice camp at Nottawasepi Potawatomi was at the Potawatomi tribe. Like, native folks didn't have to go to the university. The folks from the university had to actually go to the tribe and had to talk about their knowledge with people who know a whole lot more about that particular area that they do. And for me, that's one of the key things about beginning to decenter some of the privileges that you have in many universities is that as academics and professors, we actually need to do our work within the community and be accountable to those communities. And I actually think it's very powerful for students at a campus to see one of their professors struggle to be able to make a contribution when there's elders surrounding that person who just know much, much more about that region. And that's been a key hallmark of the work that I do, is to begin to find ways for students, not just students who are Native, but all students to realize that for us, we have knowledge in our communities, we have ancient knowledge systems, we have knowledge systems that today are extremely important to who we are and should be considered equally with those knowledge systems that flourish in the universities, but often are not part of the work that we do as Indigenous people. Probably my most extensive work is with the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation. So as a little bit of background, before colonization, we did our own thing as Native folks with regard to education, right? We had our own educational institutions, and they weren't really like the ones we have here. I mean, you didn't have to, go into debt to study at any of them, right? And they were ones that had pretty high levels of peer review, and you might call it a scholarly rigor, especially because anybody who's considered a knowledge keeper had to constantly be reporting their results to people that were actually using the knowledge, and those people in the community got to critique and criticize. And so we had very high standards of peer review and a very accessible educational system and a very inclusive educational system that didn't leave out anybody. I'm not saying it was the best, right? But oftentimes compared to the types of struggles and challenges that we see in the higher education and other educational systems in the United States, it was a decent system. And so today, a lot of tribes were not known as being centers of education. And so what we're trying to do is actually take that ground back. And we're trying to, again, be communities that have educational institutions that can draw Native people and non-Native people to where we are to then create the research and the teaching capacity. So the Menominee people are not Anishinaabe, but they're closely related. They're a Great Lakes tribe. You can see their reservation area from a satellite because it's the only green patch in that part of Wisconsin. They survived horrendous colonialism in the 19th century because they were able to reinvent themselves as a forestry tribe and create a sustainable forestry operation within their community that sustains them culturally, economically, and socially. And there's a lot of pride, not just for Menominee people, but also people like myself, to see that biodiverse forest that has been a key part of that community's survival and sustenance through some of the worst things that any human society could do to another. And the College of Menominee Nation, which was founded in the early 1990s, one of the first things it did is it created an Indigenous Menominee Research Center, its own research center, which goes against kind of the trend in some kind of tribal college institutions that the education is just technical training. So this is a research institution. And so I've worked very hard for the last 10 years. We were recently awarded 2 university awards for our collaborative work together from my university, Michigan State. We wanted to make the Sustainable Development Institute actually the central hub for advising tribes in the region on how to address climate change. And so instead of like the idea that Michigan State or University of Michigan or University of Wisconsin should be a hub for climate change information, we wanted to make the Sustainable Development Institute that hub. And so we rolled out multiple projects in education, research, training, all sorts of areas to make that happen. So one thing we did is, in a collaboration with Michigan State and the Sustainable Development Institute, we create different teams of students from both campuses, as well as faculty and staff from those campuses. And each team of 6 to 10 people would work with a particular tribe in the area on their climate change plan. And so we created a facilitation process to provide support for each tribe to help mobilize them to get ready for the climate change issues in their area. So this is one of our tribal teams that worked with Forest County Potawatomi tribe. We organized conferences that try to bring together scientists and Indigenous knowledge keepers, but instead of what always happens is that these conferences are at like places like Michigan State or Santa Clara, this was hosted at the Menominee Nation. And so this is one of our series, the Shifting Seasons Conference. It happens every couple of years. We've got one coming up in a few months. And it gets hundreds of people, about half non-native scientists and about half native folks, many of whom are knowledge keepers or indigenous scientists. And we do facilitated activities throughout the whole conference to bring people together and figure out how can we bridge these divides between universities and tribes, indigenous people. And so the scientists actually have to be there on the Menominee Nation, learn directly about the land and about the Menominee experience, and that frames how they approach those conversations. And they actually have to confront, right, that in their careers they haven't really been exposed to some of that history and to some of that knowledge and background, and haven't really heard what Native folks think about what scientists could do in their work to be of benefit and to be of importance to us in the goals that we're trying to achieve. One of the fruits of this work is we have a website called the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience website or network. It's a clearinghouse of every possible amazing information you would need, whether you're Native or not, on how to prepare for climate change. So we've worked on it for some time. It serves as a clearinghouse, but also a resource to find what tribes have done and how they've succeeded in preparing for climate change. Our educational activities, of which we have a number that we do each year, are all based on Indigenous conceptions of dialogue. One of the things I always think is ironic is that in situations like this, I'm doing a lot of lecturing when I teach. Some of my students are here today in the audience. They know I do a lot of lecturing, but in these contexts, totally inappropriate. Our model, right, is that everybody's equal and everybody has different intellectual contributions to make. And in Anishinaabe culture, similar to Menominee culture, if you're in a conversation like this and somebody who's 6 years old says something, then you think, wait a minute, what was it about what we've been talking about or the topic that got them to say that? It's valued knowledge, right? It's somebody's perspective that creates value. And so what we try to do in our educational programs is also kind of decenter this bizarre authority model that you see in institutions, where I can be somebody who has no experience with the Menominee people, yet because I read a whole bunch of books about the Menominee and got a PhD, that somehow entitles me to believe that I know something about that particular community. And so what we want folks to understand is that knowledge is not just about the books that you've looked at or the classes that you've taken, but it's about experience and a life experience and who you are and your interactions with the very land that is the subject of our programs. And so in this way, we really try to decenter that conception of thinking about knowledge and begin to value people for their unique contributions and the different skill sets that they bring. And the thing that I like especially about this one program, which is called the Indigenous Planning Summer Institute, is the greatest teachers in that program are not even the human beings, right? We actually spend most of our time in the forest learning directly from the forest, learning directly from the trees, the plants, the animals, the fishes, the insects that we get a chance to encounter while we're there. And so the forest, in its spirituality, its systematicness, is our greatest teacher in that camp. And so we're able at these programs, that are, like this one is about a week long, and it's got Native students, and we've been recently inviting more non-Native students from everywhere, from universities like this one, from tribal colleges, from the Menominee tribe. And it's a great experience for people to actually have a conversation together and learn from each other about how these different programs and different types of institutions can be more collaborative and how they can support tribal goals. But as you can see with all the projects I've described so far, all of these take place on Indigenous people's lands. And that's really a key theme of almost everything I try to do, is the importance of beginning to think about our work as professors and as students here at these universities as needing to engage in places where their centrality within the educational system has been denied for generations, and actually tried to build the capacity in those places and decentralize higher education, decentralize teaching and research. And with regard to our projects there, a key thing, and I think this is where universities can play a larger role than they thought, is that we do a very careful job evaluating these initiatives. Oftentimes the work I do, and this kind of makes me mad, but it gets, classified as like diversity or inclusion. But like, oftentimes those initiatives, people don't subject them to the proper types of evaluation. It's just considered that because they're diversity initiatives, they must be fine. But we've really worked hard to make sure that the students who come, before they come to any of these programs, they help shape the evaluation of it. And then throughout the actual event itself, they are able to participate in all sorts of different activities that support the evaluation. And when the event is over, there's an active evaluation they get a chance to both participate in and to critique and review and comment on. And so one of the things we find in our programs, and this is an evaluation we did last year for one of the planning institutes, is that a lot of the students, they want to have evaluated the degree to which they strengthened relationships with others, or whether there were forces that were detracting from their capacity to strengthen relationships. And they like to use Indigenous models of how to think about the quality of relationships. This is the Menominee model of sustainability. This is another Menominee model of relationship building. And so we do evaluations using Indigenous traditions of how to think about relationships. And it's a participatory model of evaluation that focuses on things that matter, like over the course of a camp, how do one's relationships with others support their sense of land and sovereignty? And we use quantitative measures, as well as multimedia to do these evaluations. And it's something that's quite important because we're trying to establish that for our programs, we're not just doing things on tribal land and doing things within Indigenous peoples' worldviews, but we're also being very careful about what we learn from them and making sure that we're evaluating a number of important topics, including things like people's safety, their experience, their enjoyment, but also their learning outcomes. At Michigan State University, so back to the college campus, we've got a Native Studies program, and folks like me write and publish like all other professors. But we do a lot of programming on campus that also tries to decenter in a different way. So for example, last year we had a conference that was about the anniversary of the treaty that ceded the land that Michigan State University is on. Because we found a really old map of the campus that said Indian encampment in the middle of it. We're like, what's that? And we wanted to have a commemorative conference. But again, this was a conference that was thinking critically about the fact that almost nowhere on campus do we see any reference to this particular treaty. And it's very rare that the university genuinely hosts people in a place where they feel safe actually talking about some of the frustrations with the denial and lack of recognition of treaty rights in the area. And so I know at Santa Clara there's been attention and discussion about a similar type of thing, which relates to the mission that's here. And so for us, treaty rights is kind of the equivalent or the analogous topic. We've tried to reinvent spaces on campus and actually physically reinvent them. So this is an area where this is a sugar bush now. So it's a place that when you're coming out of the winter and it's starting to thaw into the spring is a good time for maple sugar. That's an Anishinaabe tradition. And so my colleagues at the American Indian Indigenous Studies program have done an amazing job creating a full sort of outdoor sugar bush just right in that area that anybody from campus is able to access. And these things are important, right, to actually see spaces that are not just curated according to kind of anti-Indigenous and racist or just forgetful, conceptions about the land. And so we have great events, and we've got great students that come out of this program, and we're really proud of all of the things that they do. And there's just a lot of emphasis that a program like this is one that helps give students a sense of confidence in their potential and who they are. And for non-Native students, right, it's a chance to actually have an intercultural experience and to gain more education and perspective. Because if you're going into a profession, no matter what, you're not comfortable in an Indigenous space or working with Indigenous people, that's not going to be great, I think, for your future, whether from a professional success standpoint or from a moral standpoint. We also do a lot of research as well on my campus about trying to understand how universities and tribes can best collaborate. So since I'm your colleague now for a few more weeks, I would never say this if I was giving a travel talk. Since I'm your colleague, you can email me at my Santa Clara email if you'd like any of this documentation that I'm talking about, because I got all sorts of PDFs and stuff to send you. One of the things that actually in my research group that we do a lot of publishing on is actually the nature of how Indigenous people and scientists can collaborate best. So we have a number of papers that just talk about the ethics of collaboration. And we find things that, like, for people of color and Native people are not, like, tremendously surprising to us, but actually a lot of scientists don't really know about. So for example, our studies, because we interview a lot of Native people and ask them what they think about what makes a collaborative relationship work, they say things like, well, we're more concerned about trust than we are about publishing a paper. And so I think for a lot of scientists, that begins to get them to reframe actually how they approach a collaboration, thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm going to be perceived as an agent of a corporation or an agent of the state when I approach a tribe to do work. And so maybe spending time at the get-go building trust, even if that's a little bit slow, is more important than trying to dive in with incentives for what we can publish together. And recently, on my campus and in my collaborative work, we've been getting to really, really fun stuff, which I would encourage folks to do. The students from Michigan State University and other Anishinaabe people, we put together a group of about 25, 26 Anishinaabe people and spent about 10 days in Aotearoa, New Zealand, being hosted by 2 tribes there and having an exchange of philosophy. And it was, like, fantastic. And the work that I do on campus and just in general is possible because I work with fantastic people. So one person that I've really tried to support her work is Sherry Copenhace, who's a knowledge keeper and Anishinaabe. And it's really hard to get a picture of Sherry actually because she's really humble and avoids the camera. But she's a fluent speaker of her language and a knowledge keeper and an amazing educator. And she doesn't have a PhD, but she's like far more smart than I will ever be, and is an amazing expert and specialist and just an amazing human being. And so I think a key part of sort of decolonizing our campuses is actually empowering people like Sherry to be able to do their work and have the same degree of respect and authority that someone, say, with like a PhD would have on a campus. And actually, she deserves much more. And in sort of wrapping up, the final example that I wanted to show you has to do with some of the work that I've done to empower tribes to address climate change. And so one of the things that we found when I've been collaborating with tribes on how they should best prepare for climate change is that when a tribe would receive funding to generate a climate change plan, oftentimes that funding would go to a very junior staff person in the tribe with primarily a scientific background. Yet to actually build a climate change plan, they would have to do things that they weren't trained to do. They'd have to persuade tribal council. They'd have to have community engagement events. They would have to be aware of how their climate change work fit into state and federal policy. All sorts of things. In fact, most people that were getting grants and funding for climate change didn't even have the time for strategic planning and didn't even know who the other people were in the tribe that might want to work with them on climate change. So I partnered with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and we created a program that would provide that space. So we invited tribes to come with 3 or 4 people, a combination of their tribal staff who are scientists and community members, and they would spend a week together, hosted by a tribe, and with instructors who are from tribes, from universities, all over the place, to work with them on a strategic planning for climate change. We do it over the course of about a week. And so the way that we would do it is, so it'd be hosted, of course, in a beautiful part of Indian country. This is the Nez Perce tribe. And we created a curriculum on climate change that was driven by elders. And this is one of the highlights of the event, right? So you first learn about climate change from our traditions, engage in team building activities so that the teams would build camaraderie. Right, it's a lot of fun. And of course, the food is amazing, right? Local food, right? We learn about the host tribe, what they're doing, both blending their traditional knowledge and their scientific knowledge to protect things like salmon in the face of climate change. And we do public and community events. And so all the while, while these things are happening, right, each team is working really, really hard on doing strategic planning and doing so in a way that combines both their traditions as well as science. And so this program is funded by a combination of universities and federal grants. And everyone comes together in a supportive environment to talk about how we all can support each team's strategic planning efforts. And what's really cool about this program is that, again, it's not a lot of lecturing, it's all collaborative. And when a lot of the tribes come up with their plans, they're incredible, right? They're based on their traditional values and knowledge, and then they translate directly into particular ways and applications of doing science and doing research. So at the end of the week, everybody presents their final projects. Amelia Marchand and Jeanette Findley, for example, from the Colville tribe, they created like an incredible model during their time at the camp for thinking about how Colville would respond to climate change, right? And this stuff is just awesome, especially because each tribe is doing something that's different and that's unique to where they're from and their location. And so that's actually this is how they're going to approach climate change. It's based on relationships, but it brings together both their traditional knowledge as well as scientific knowledge about climate change. Or, for example, we worked with the Seminole tribe of Florida. This is Juan Cancel, who was one of the team members that came there. And they did a great job thinking about how to create a grassroots climate change movement within the tribe, right? And we developed this curriculum for the camp that they followed through with, and it came up with an incredibly empowering way to motivate people within that community to take climate change seriously and to build out a climate policy and research program. And so these types of outcomes are not actually ones that oftentimes universities measure when they review people for their promotions. These are actually policies that those tribes adopt. And while oftentimes if we generate research, like say, goes into United States policy, that's considered something that is of value. But when you actually do something that supports a tribe's policy or its sovereignty, that's not something that's considered to be valuable or something that you would report. And so part of what's needed is for our universities to actually support scholars who are able to do work, research, and teaching that generates those types of outcomes. You can imagine the students I work with, undergrad and grad students, they get to come to all these things. And it's part of my mentorship of them that they participate in these events and activities. So by the time they graduate and interview for jobs, they're like seasoned and like ready and can win an interview, right? Because they've been through experiences like this where they've had to learn what it means to be in intercultural context. They've had to learn what it means to build trust and accountability and consent. They learn how to evaluate things. They learn how to create an open curriculum where everybody gets to talk and discuss. They learn the basics of mediation. So they genuinely become professionals. And by the way, they learn the research skills too, right? But for us, it's more important is the entire person and their ability not only to connect with communities that they're familiar with, but to work with people from all over. And so I wanted to just share with you all some of these examples, and depending on what might come up in the question and answer, there's also some more things that I'm happy to discuss as well, because I do also work at the policy level and sort of think tank level as well, and my university is very supportive of that. But I want to say miigwech, and thanks to all for coming, and I look forward to talking and hanging out a bit more as the night progresses.
So we have 15 minutes for Q&A, and then for those of you who RSVP'd for the dinner afterwards, a couple of people are going to lead you over to Nobley Dining Hall. Chris, would you raise your hand? Chris Bacon can lead you there. Iris can also lead you there. Ed Maurer, can you raise your hand? Ed can lead you there. Just follow one of the three of them, and they'll lead you to Nobley afterwards if you RSVP'd for the dinner. And I'll meet you all over there.
I didn't listen at all to those instructions, so.
You don't need to. They'll spell it.
Okay, yes. And what's your name?
My name is Bill. I'd like to know more about the Department of Sustainable Community.
Sure.
Can you talk about it? What is the curriculum? Does one get a degree in it?
Sure. Yeah, so what's interesting about the College of Menominee Nation is that in 1994, they founded this institute of sustainable development just a few years after the Brundtland Report sort of made more popular that concept of sustainability. And a lot of universities like Arizona State, their graduate programs in sustainability, which are supposedly the first in the nation, were founded like 10 years later. And so the Menominee were actually kind of onto this idea of sustainability before some of these other institutes of higher education did so. And so this institute, it literally is a research institute that is able to facilitate a number of different projects. So they have a staff, and they do research related to forestry. They do research related to phenology, or sort of a way of gathering observations about climate change. They do event organization to bring different academics together. They've hosted graduate students and postdocs from other universities like my campus. And at least with them, we do a lot of publishing. So it's literally just like a research institute. At any one time, they probably have about 6 or 7 staff. And it can swell to much larger if they have a grant project or something like that that brings in more postdocs or grad students or undergraduates. And they have a garden, and they've got a really cool walkway and phenology trail that's part of the institute. And so it's really a wonderful place and a chance for people to learn more, especially about the Menominee forest. But I've got a lot of literature I can send you.
Is this the group that's at Michigan State?
No, it's at the Menominee tribe, but I've worked with them for 10 years in my job at Michigan State.
I know you identified something called the Department of Sustainable Community in Michigan State.
Oh,
What's that?
this is kind of embarrassing. I misunderstood your question.
That's okay. People do all the time.
So I'm in, one of my departments is called the Department of Community Sustainability.
Oh.
And it's actually a conglomeration of a bunch of what I would call old school land grant departments. And so we used to be called CARS, which stood for the conglomeration of a department called Community Agriculture, department called Resource Studies, department called Recreation, department called Tourism, and then Agricultural Education. So they brought all these departments together into one. They called it CARS. And then that was confusing, so we rebranded it Community Sustainability. And so now it's like an environmental studies program. But most of the scholars actually are doing some kind of community-based work, including people who have appointments in extension. Sorry I got that wrong, but I'm glad you still gave me by accident an opportunity to say more about the Sustainable Development Institute. Other questions? Yes, what's your name again?
Chris. I guess 2 things. One is, how has it worked out? I mean, it was just an amazing sort of tour de force, sort of all of these different cases, and it seems like there's some common themes in Indigenous development of climate adaptation and climate plans. How, when you see some of the opportunities from, with different tribes setting kind of the terms of engagement and when they work with universities, is there like a common set of principles or anything that you or the teams adhere to, or is it really very much different based on which group that you're working with in their context?
Yeah, good question. And I also have some research on that it's on my website, but I can also send it to folks since we're still colleagues for a few more weeks. So there are principles that can be helpful, but probably the biggest principle in Indian country is be prepared for anything. And that's probably one of the best things you can learn. But more specifically though, so one of the things that I've really found, because I both, on the one hand, because I'm Anishinaabe, that might seem to be like some kind of like, advantage, for collaborating. But I think folks who are from that community and others know that that's not necessarily true. But what we've really learned is the importance of what it means to think of oneself, if you're coming from a university, and that your work as a collaborator is more like a diplomatic role. See, it would be fantastic, say like in Michigan State, if things were perfect, then the governor of my state, not even the president of the university, the governor of the state would interface directly with all the tribal leaders and then determine what people like me would do. And the second best would be if like the president of the university actually interfaced with the tribal leaders. But remember, from a tribal perspective, our elected leaders are at the same level as the governor, as well as obviously the president of the United States. And so because we don't have that happening, that it's actually up to us as researchers to treat it like a diplomatic situation, which means that the emphasis should be on trust, consent, reciprocity, and building up those relationships. And what I find that a lot of Native people, including my tribe, are looking for is they're less concerned with whether a isolated and discrete collaboration could just produce new knowledge, and are more concerned with whether they're building long-term relationships with research institutions that could be sustaining over many generations. And I was saying this in a talk I gave a couple days ago here, that what people I think oftentimes don't really understand about Indigenous knowledge systems is that our sciences were not just about information, how to get the best information, we did that too, but they're about how can you have a really good network of knowers, of knowledge keepers, that could be able to work together no matter what the circumstance was, even under extreme times of crisis. And so I think because there's so much division between and distrust between universities and tribes and tribal institutions, that people recognize that actually that's not a very resilient situation. And so it's more important for us to actually focus on building those relationships, even if it's slow, than kind of throwing all our energy into a discrete, information or knowledge-based research project that once it's completed, people could just walk their separate ways. But is that a strong knowledge system, a project by project one, or one in which there's much more mutuality? Yep, thanks for your question. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the unique or special situation that led to the foundation of the Climate Institute on the native grounds. And I don't know how familiar you are with the situation in California. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of the level of interest or the concern of the issues of maybe our tribal neighbors here.
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for your question. So for the first part of your question, one of the things I've tried, so I've trained like over 700, it's probably way more than that, climate scientists and how to work effectively with tribes. And one of the things that I've pushed for climate scientists to really understand, and I've had a lot of success with this, is to really realize that actually the greatest sustainability stories we know are tribes. I mean, the Menominee tribe literally had their land decimated to the point where they had a fraction of the land that their ancestors lived on within a generation. They literally had to find a way to completely reinvent themselves and created one of the first, it was literally, I think, the first designated sustainable yield forest in the United States. If you look in a history book, it doesn't say that. It says, I can't remember what's the one that's typically understood as the first sustainable yield. It's actually the Menominee Forest. Or like my tribe was relocated to Oklahoma in the 19th century, forcibly. We went from Michigan to Oklahoma. That's crazy, right? And we're still here. And we are now the biggest economic force in that area. We have it's more than this now, $600 million economy. We run the utility. We have all sorts of programs, businesses. We're vital to that region. And so sustainability for a lot of Native people, and this is how the Menominee understood it, they were not just thinking about sustainability in terms of like the future climate crisis, right, or the biodiversity loss crisis, but thinking about the fact that they had sustained themselves, having had to endure much more intense types of anthropogenic changes, right? And so a lot of the interest then in sustainability comes from that perspective and actually wanting to learn from the past about how communities adapted and sustained themselves. Tell me one word from the second part of your question. I'll remember it in a second.
Oh, so I was wondering about how the landscape here in California.
Oh, right,
works.
that's right. Sorry, I remember. So one of the things I've been telling folks about here is, where I work, we're dealing with things like treaty rights, statutes. There's a certain level of legal protection that, say, tribes in Michigan or Wisconsin have. Now, if you're looking at the Anglophone settler states, there's two in particular that have been particularly vicious to Native people, where you have the least amount of rights and policy. So you have Australia, you have California. California is, I mean, it's an embarrassment and it's a humiliation. The fact that, with the exception of a few tribes to the north, right, almost all the tribes here either unrecognized or they have unratified treaties. So they're not even treaties. And the level of land dispossession and the intensity of recent, fairly recent genocidal activities here is just something that actually, even from a standpoint of Michigan, is hard to believe. And this is a so-called liberal state, right? And the fact that, like, in Michigan, and to use a science fiction metaphor, we are light years ahead on tribal rights and sovereignty than in California is really truly hypocritical. And I do mean that. I mean, it's really pathetic and hypocritical how Native people are treated here. And the fact that tribes here who have been here for generations are actually struggling just to be recognized, or just to even have a land base that's kind of close to their ancestral home, is horrifying. And so a lot of folks that work in my context, they're not used to that particular type of struggle. And so here, a colleague of mine at UC Davis, Beth Rose Middleton, did some excellent work that talks about how tribes in California have had to use all of these tools that other tribes haven't considered to legally protect land, conservation easements, and other tools that nonprofits use. And that, like in other parts of Indian country, that's just not a reality that we've had to reckon with. And actually, we're now learning about how they've done that, trying to apply it where we are. But here in California, right, when I've talked to a lot of Native folks here and interacted, it's more about trying to find ways to actually first have access to sufficient areas of land to then build from, to build research, to build education. But if researchers are not actually caring about addressing the massive land dispossession here, I think it's going to be very, very hard for those researchers or those students to be respected by the tribes in this area. But anyways, yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you. It's very illuminating.
Might have time for just one more, and I'll answer it super quick. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah. What's your name?
Kristen.
Yep.
A lot of the work that you're doing that you described tonight is about climate crisis mitigation and kind of dealing with what is coming. I also agree and believe that Indigenous people are our best teachers and leaders to change the pretty desperate prognosis we have for the direction things are going in. If we follow them and follow them, we have a better chance of survival altogether for humanity. To what degree do you think that the work that you're doing is about changing the trajectories that we are on for species extinction and global warming and the crisis that comes with that, versus kind of a radical acceptance of the need to adapt and mitigate that?
Yeah, and thanks for your question. I'll then close on some views I have about that. And just the brief version. So a couple of points. So point number one is that one of the big problems of the environmental movement and the climate urgency movement is that a lot of it is based on the idea that we're trying to save something about today's world from the peril of climate change in the future. But going back to my colleague's question, if you're from like a tribe in California, what about today would you want to save? I mean, right, people don't have access to their own homelands, right? They face challenges and restrictions on their land, rampant forms of abuse, harassment, and so on against Native people. I don't even talk about other forms of racism and discrimination other groups face, right? There's not a whole lot about today that I feel is worth saving. And so I think people have to realize that the dystopia is not in the future. For populations like Indigenous people, we're already in it, and we're trying to get out of it. And because we're trying to get out of the dystopia, not trying to avoid it, we're thinking very differently about what we need to be urgent about. And so this is kind of the second point, right? Is that Native people, in my opinion, we're urgent about rekindling kinship. What's kinship? It means relationships and cultures of trust, accountability, consent, reciprocity, the things that are lacking at universities and in professional spaces, and as we know, other parts of our life too. We're not worried about rights. Everybody's got rights. We're not worried about legal things, because oftentimes what makes somebody in a position to be abused or discriminated against is that there actually aren't cultures that respect people's consent or respect people's safety. And so we're thinking about the realm of kinship. But there's a little bit of a problem with that. And if you think about it historically, and without, giving us too much credit, but you can think about all sorts of cultures like this, right? North America, prior to the devastation of the United States, and this was true in the fur trade, but obviously before that, was about vast networks of people that interacted in very strategic and well-planned ways through kinship relationships, and were able to respond to a constantly changing world around them. That was a solid system of kinship, and it endured pretty well. And obviously it still does, right? I mean, my colleague Mashonda Goman talks about how these highly adaptive indigenous kinship networks were what people used when they were relocated to big cities during the U.S. relocation program to survive in those kind of hostile areas. But those resilient kinship networks, they're ecosystems, right? They're systems of relationships. They have a tipping point too. Right? The climate system and the environmental system, the Earth system has a tipping point. Everybody's worried about that tipping point being breached, right? Or that tipping point happening. But no one ever talks about the relational tipping point, right? And the relational tipping point is the one that when really crazy changes happen, you can still live in a good way, in a safe way, even if your lifestyle changes a lot. But given what we've been through with colonialism, I think that tipping point already passed. And so in some of my recent research, I've been looking at how even the solutions to climate change are actually pretty bad for indigenous people. And so even if we have an energy transition, and even if we lower carbon footprint, you're still going to have land dispossession, you're still going to have indigenous people cut out of the energy sector, economically speaking, and a number of other issues. And we need to work on the relational system, the kinship system, but that might take so long that the dangerous parts of climate change still happen. But it depends on what world you want, right? Do you want a world with no carbon in the atmosphere and rampant injustice? Or do you want a world of kinship that is better able to respond to changes that maybe it's too late to fully stop and advance? But anyways, I'll close with that because I think we've got to get it. But thanks for your question. Good to meet everybody, and keep in touch. I've got a Santa Clara email for 3 or 4 more weeks, and I'm happy to connect while I'm here. Miigwech.